addressing loss and damage is a crucial third pillar of climate action. Loss and damage is linked to adaptation and mitigation because it happens when efforts to reduce emissions are not ambitious enough and when adaptation efforts are unsuccessful or impossible to implement. As the magnitude of climate change increases, so does the likelihood of exceeding adaptation limits. These adaptation limits are reached in two ways. Soft limits are when adaptation options exist, but communities don't have the financial resources to pursue them. Hard limits are reached when there are no reasonable prospects for avoiding intolerable risks. These limits are particularly acute in vulnerable communities that lack the resources needed to implement effective adaptation options. Coral reefs offer a good example of where adaptation is likely to reach the limits. The IPCC found that 70 to 90% of tropical coral reefs will die by mid-century, even if temperature rise is limited to 1.5 degrees Celsius, with nearly total loss under 2 degrees Celsius of warming. This will lead to irreversible losses of biodiversity and have a major impact on coastal communities that eat and sell fish that live along reefs. So loss and damage occur when adaptation limits are reached, and it results in destruction of livelihoods, assets, and forces displacement. Loss and damage can be classified in two main ways. One, economic loss and damage, and two, non-economic loss and damage. In terms of economic loss and damage, the impacts are already being felt across all sectors, including agriculture, energy, infrastructure, water resources, and health. Global GDP losses are projected to increase significantly if warming exceeds 2 degrees Celsius. The Loss and Damage Collaboration, a network of NGOs working on the issue, has estimated that developing countries' loss and damage needs add up to about $400 billion a year. Another study published by Nature found that South Asia could experience a median income loss of 22% by 2050 due to climate change impacts. Economic shocks from extreme weather events such as floods, droughts, and hurricanes disrupt supply chains, destroy critical infrastructure, and reduce agricultural productivity. The economic costs can hence be divided into two major categories: direct costs and indirect costs. Direct costs are immediate and visible. These include damaged infrastructure like roads, bridges, and homes, crop failures and reduced food production, loss of property and assets from floods, storms, and fires. Indirect costs are more complex and longer term. These include reduced labor productivity due to extreme heat, increased healthcare costs from climate-related diseases and malnutrition, disruptions of trade and supply chains, climate-induced migration, and the associated socioeconomic strain on receiving communities. Combined, these direct and indirect costs threaten economic stability, deepen inequality across least developed countries, and make it harder for vulnerable nations to achieve development goals. Non-economic loss and damage is more values-based and intangible. Non-economic losses and damages include loss of human and non-human life, loss of mental and physical health, loss of culture and indigenous knowledge, loss of sense of place, social cohesion, and agency, just to give you some of the examples. Some climate impacts are permanent and existential, especially for vulnerable regions like Pacific Island nations. Despite their minimal contributions to greenhouse gas emissions, they face sea level rise, tropical cyclones, and forced displacement. There is growing recognition that beyond material loss, losses and damages deeply affect values, identities, and cultures. Non-economic losses, such as loss of traditional knowledge, social cohesion, and dignity, are harder to quantify but critical to understand. Climate justice issues arise because the people who are least responsible for the climate change suffer its worst impacts. Extreme weather events disproportionately affect the poorest and most vulnerable populations. Therefore, addressing loss and damage also involves questions of justice and accountability. Developed countries, who historically contributed most to greenhouse gas emissions, are increasingly being called upon to provide financial, technical, and legal support to affected nations. At COP27, countries agreed for the first time to put loss and damage funding arrangements on the formal agenda. This culminated in a historic decision to establish a loss and damage fund, which became operationalized in COP28. On day one of COP28, after months of intense and contentious negotiations, countries set the loss and damage fund in motion and agreed on critical details. Over the following 2 weeks, in COP28, countries pledged almost $700 million to start filling the fund. The Santiago Network plays a crucial role in enhancing delivery of action and support to address climate change impacts in developing countries. Its mandate includes facilitating access to knowledge, resources, and technical assistance to address climate risks comprehensively. This was a landmark moment for loss and damage negotiations, but the work is far from done. At a 3D meeting in Barbados in April 2025, the Fund for Responding to Loss and Damage have announced that it will spend $250 million until the end of 2026 on an initial set of interventions to help developing countries deal with the aftermath of climate-driven disasters. This is just the start, but not enough. Despite pledging $768 million in the fund, governments have so far signed contribution agreements for $495 million and only paid $321 million. As stated earlier, the Loss and Damage Collaboration has estimated that developing countries' loss and damage needs add up to about $400 billion a year. I leave you with a few quotes from the most prolific climate justice activist, scientist, the late Professor Dr. Salim ul Haq. Thank you.